Hi, I'm Laura Clark, Vice Chancellor for Academics at the University of Arkansas Hope-Texarkana and serving as the Interim Chancellor.
Hello, I'm Brian Berry. I'm the Vice Chancellor for Student Services at UAHT.
Our presentation is titled, Changing the Bookstore Model for Student Access and Success. To start, we would like to provide some background about our campus and the problem. We are a small community college of approximately 1,500 students. We currently have 3 campuses. Our main campus is here in Hope, Arkansas, where about 75% of our students enroll. A second campus is about 8 years old in Texarkana, and then we have a unique bladesmith school located about 8 miles out of town in historic Washington State Park. Our college serves a 5-county area with several students coming from Texas and Louisiana. We would be considered rural in nature, and many of our students, 66% approximately, are financial aid eligible. Prior to our new bookstore model, our campus leased a small space to a textbook company. This company took our recommended textbook request, ordered, sold books to our students, sold other merchandise, just like most traditional bookstores do. But around 2010, we started to see a trend where our book costs skyrocketed. Not just with the costs themselves, but the constant new addition to books. We also started to see a trend of codes, especially in mathematics and then later to other subjects. And out in the web, we noticed rental stores gaining popularity. Those were somewhat more reasonable, but it required our students to have a credit card. We began having reports from faculty that students weren't buying some of their textbooks because of the cost. Our registrar and advisors were reporting students dropping some of their classes after going to class and then going to pick up their books. One of the reasons this was happening is because in many cases, the book cost more than the class. Our campus, proudly, is one of the lowest tuition and fees campuses in Arkansas. Our bookstore was much like all the rest, sold mostly new, always latest edition, because they could not get more used text or last year's editions. They did do buyback depending on the demand of the used books. They did some rental, and they loved using the code. I'm sure that sounds very familiar. So let me transition over here to show you what it looked like. So this slide is a book cost comparison to tuition, and this is just a typical schedule for one of our associate degree students. General algebra, comp 1, psychology, history, and biology. And then these are actual costs. The new book cost, as you can see, versus the used book cost. So that would range between $1,200 and $1,000 for the books. They did have a rental model, and you can see the cost on those running from $123 to $273. So if you rented all of your books and was able to rent all your books, it would cost about $927. But then notice our tuition of $968 and fees at that time. So our tuition of $1,232 was very similar to the purchase price of books. And matter of fact, on some of these books were greatly more than what the class would cost. So we all know the problem of textbook costs has been around for years. In about 2012, 2013, our Vice Chancellor of Academics then started really researching and investigating our actual price list, and then looked outwardly away from our institution. And we noticed that this was not a problem just of our own, but it was a national problem. So if you'll notice here, we had lots of journals and articles that was written inside higher ed. The textbook prices more transparent but still high. USA Today, college students say no to costly textbooks. So both of these articles with the additional several more were sent out to our campus in 2013 in order to gain an understanding of our problem and how are we going to resolve it. So academics met to discuss the situation, and by the following academic year we started this new model, which we were very excited about. It was called the Textbook Challenge. And this involved, number one, educating ourselves on what our options were in decreasing cost. The challenge was for each academic department to start finding savings in the books they were actually requesting. So they wanted us to go to more inexpensive books and see if we could keep them longer. So each division or department had to have at least one book change, and this was a pretty huge project. It was also very eye-opening to what the current cost of our books were. So this slide shows just a couple of examples from that 2013 model and that presentation. So for example, the Health Professions Division eliminated some books that were unnecessary. These may be optional. We all know students don't do optional. And then the Business Technology started using some online resources in lieu of. So we tried to make some differences in this to save students money. Some with cheaper textbooks, some went with online resources, some tried to do a bundle, and some customized the books by reducing unnecessary chapters. But it still did not eliminate the problem. It did not control markup, constant new editions, inability for our bookstore to keep used editions or to get the editions that we requested. Codes were astronomical, and rental costs were high, higher than the online bookstores that required a credit card. And then our students' buyback was not very good on their books. It also didn't solve the problem that we had with open source problems. Open resources are great. However, a lot of times these sources provided a lot of information, and our students would have to get them digitally or go and actually print the entire book out. So even with our efforts, the costs were still horribly expensive.
The slide you're viewing now shows the revenue from our contracted vendor for the last 4 years of that contract. You'll note the 2014 revenue is a little lower because they were not here for the full summer terms, and so it's a little less. You can see it was pretty consistent over the last 4 years of that contract, and our share, or the commission they paid us, was pretty close to about $40,000 per year, or our share of the commission that the private book vendor paid us for being our vendor on campus. Fiscal year 2015 was the last year of our contract with a private book company that had operated our bookstore. Arkansas procurement law allows contracts to be renewed a maximum of 6 years after the original contract term before rebidding or a new RFP has to be issued. We really wanted to find a way to make textbooks more affordable for our students. We considered transitioning to a self-operated bookstore with a new model, but we're hesitant to start a bookstore on our own since we had not done so before, and we really hoped our RFP would encourage innovation and ideas to help our students save money on book costs. We had a discussion with our current vendor at that time, as well as most of the major bookstore vendors in preparing our RFP. When we issued the RFP, it specifically requested that proposals address reduced price structure for the lowest possible book costs for our students. The pricing proposal section constituted 50% of the scoring criteria in our RFP, more than double the weight of the next highest criterion. We also noted in the RFP that a commission to the college was not required. A couple of the vendors actually called to make sure we were serious about that, and we assured them that we were. So we issued our RFP with the higher criteria that we really wanted to save our students money. Got those responses back, reviewed those responses, and determined that none had met our goal of reducing costs to students. Most of the vendors have proposed options of not providing a commission to the college and lowering their book markup by 1 or 2 percentage points. So not really much savings to our students. So we notified all the respondents that we were not awarding any of the contract to any of the vendors. So in May 2015, we decided that we would start our own self-operated book program, and that gave us only till July 1 to get it up and going for our summer 2 term. We had 2 main goals in developing our new book program. One, provide affordable textbooks for students, and really affordable. We wanted to make a huge difference in the cost to our students. And secondly, to eventually provide a positive cash flow for the campus. Our initial plan was that we needed to break even after 2 years of doing the program. In order to meet these goals, we decided we were going to bring textbooks in-house so we had more control over the cost. We wanted to minimize the number of consumables, codes, workbooks, etc., because they're high cost and they can't be reused or rented. Ideally, we wanted to identify employees that were already on campus employed who could take on these new tasks. We wanted to commit to near being an all rental program, so not sell any books or as few as possible. And so, based on these principles, we ended up with two entities: our book rental program, which is a rental only program, and a separate foundation store that's run by our UAHT Foundation that provides consumables and then assorted goods as t-shirts, calculators, and a few approved books that had to be replaced and were consumable that would be sold each semester. So for this presentation, we're going to focus on our book rental program. And as we noted earlier, we wanted to utilize existing campus staff and space. Our library had been very much underutilized for some time. In 2015, it was about books and magazines. It looked much the same way it had looked since the early 90s. Our library physically occupies one half of a large academic building. We had a large classroom directly adjacent to the entrance of the library, and we decided to change that space from a classroom to a book rental space. We also added a door so there was direct access from the library and placed the book rental program just outside the library in that former classroom space. We at that time and still have 3 full-time library employees who do not have any other duties outside typical library functions. We don't do tutoring in our library or provide multimedia or any other services in our library, such as many colleges do. The underutilization of our library facilities and staff, and along with students' preference to access library materials online, made it possible for us to add these book program duties to our current library staff. The library personnel staff the textbook program during times of rental and rental return, and they're also available anytime students need to return a book early or have a textbook problem. For example, our textbook program is staffed 3 days before class starts, and then about 2 weeks at the beginning of each semester, and then during the last few days of final and right after finals end. These time periods, particularly at the beginning of the semester, had always been extremely low utilization times of our library resources, so our staff was available to serve students without avoiding any of their typical library staff duties.
So now I want to talk a little bit about the program details. We rent books for $20 a credit hour. So for a 3 credit hour course, you're looking at about $60 plus tax. We do this regardless of the number of books for that course. So for example, our composition course oftentimes carries 2 or maybe 3 books, but it's a 3 credit hour course. So those 3 books will cost $60. If a course does not have a book, they are not charged. Textbooks can be charged to student accounts if they have scholarships or financial aid. They can also be charged to a third party. We have students on our campus who are high school students, and their high school actually will pay for their books, so we can actually have that option. So here's a little caveat. Rental is optional, but it is an all in or all out. And this is really important. Because we've noticed across that this is going to make the model solid, and we have an estimated amount of revenue, and students can predict their cost every time. So we don't let students what we call cherry pick. They can't pick the biology book but not the fine art book. Our book return date is the last day to final exams. If they don't return their book, we charge them $65 per book. And we came up with this number because when we first invested in our books, when we bought the books online, when we bought them from actually the previous book company, we divided the cost by the number of books we actually had in hand, and it came out to $65 a book, which is really easy because that's about what our rental cost is per course. If a book is returned, but it's returned after the return date, so as Brian said, our due date is during finals week. So the last day of finals, when finals are due, that's the last day you can turn in your book. But let's say they turn it in just before classes start the next semester, we will remove the non-return fee, but we do charge them a $15 late fee. And we do this because we do want those books back. Trying to replace that book a week before classes start will be almost impossible, and it will probably cost us 2 or 3 times the original cost of the book because of the demand. But we do want students to be encouraged to return their book, and so that's why we apply the $15 fee. So let me show you a slide here of what this actually looks like to the student. So if you'll notice here, again, here's a set of books. These are some actually from a schedule that we had. And it shows the books, what they actually cost based on the previous year's cost sheet. You can see Comp 1 had 3 books. Biology had a lecture and a lab. You have your US history book, your intro to computer book, and your algebra there. And so you can see where the total costs are. And then over there on the side, that is our actual cost without taxes. So what you end up having is, if you compare the bottom line, the rental program is approximately 1/3 the cost of used books and 1/4 cost of new books. If you'll go to this slide, this is kind of a cost comparison on average per student. So here you see the previous model had $349 per student. That was the average cost if you divide the total revenue by the total number of students. UAHT's new book rental program averaged $194 per student. And so you can also see the difference in revenue. But you also can see the total savings. The total savings to our students was over $300,000. And this is an average savings per student of $154.
Now, at this point, we want to share some of the results of the program after implementation. So the slide you're viewing now shows the participation rate of our students. We weren't really sure, since this was a new program, how many students would take advantage of it. Fall 2015 was the first really full rollout of the program. We did have a bit of a soft opening that summer, the summer 2 term, which is a very small term for us, and so it gave us a chance to iron out a few of the hiccups. But you can see those participation rates have been fairly steady over the 5 full years of data that we have. You'll know spring is usually a couple of percentage points lower. We do have some concurrent programs that have bought textbooks and so that the school districts maintain. And so we usually see just a little bit of a dip in the spring semester. But overall, participation rates have held fairly steady term to term. We also want to acknowledge that correlation does not imply causation, but we did see improvement in student outcomes after the book program was implemented. In the first 2 years directly after the program, we did see an increase in both our retention and persistent rates. We also had faculty report that many more of their students showed up on the first day of classes with their books in hand, and far fewer students who completed the semester without ever having their textbook. We surveyed our students directly after our first semester of implementing the program. And so these numbers, of course, would be much better now, but we did have a few issues when we first rolled out in terms of getting inventory for some high demand books. And we'll share that was a huge issue with our private vendor. My office was on the second floor of the Student Center directly above our book program, our bookstore at that time before we moved it. And I saw a steady number of students every day complaining about the bookstore didn't have their book and couldn't get it for a couple of weeks. So this is, even though these numbers are not as high as we would have liked them after the first semester, much more students were much more satisfied with it than they were with our private book vendor. So we had 71% of our students agreed their books were available. And at that time, after the first semester, 76% agreed that they would definitely use the program again. 83% agreed that they had saved money. We're going to take for granted that those were the students that had used our private vendor before, rather than searching on the internet to get their textbooks. So let's visit about the financial performance of our program. As you'll recall, we hope to break even after the second year of our program. Fiscal year 16 was the first year of the program. We were prepared to lose about $200,000 that first year because of the purchases that we had. Not being self-op before, we had to come up with all the inventory for that first year. The participation rates were higher than we anticipated they would be. And so we had a net loss of $63,938 after the first full fiscal year. You can see the second fiscal year, we actually had a very nice net after expenses for the year. And you can see each year we've had a pretty good net proceeds from that program. So over the course of those 5 fiscal years, we've had net revenue over expenses of just short of $1 million, and invested just over $1 million in the program with just over $2 million of total revenue. So we have been incredibly pleased with the revenue and participation of our students, as well as their satisfaction with the program. As you'll note, we had revenue, had quite a bit of net revenue, so we wanted to make sure that we reinvested that money in programs that students would see the benefit. So one of those things we wanted to do was put money back in our library, since they had taken on those new duties and making sure the program was successful. So our library, as we noted, was in a large academic building. And so you can see the slide on the left, that far left, even though we reoriented the entry to the library in what was just a blank wall with one emergency exit that had some runoff issues and water infiltration issues. We redid that, made it much nicer, attractive entry to campus that matched up better to the rest of the campus and new buildings that had been built since our library building. The interior of our library was very much had a 80s, early 90s vibe, traditional high school looking library. And so we wanted to make it a space that students thought would be cool, sort of had a coffee house vibe, and that they would want to spend time in when they weren't doing research, a place that they could hang out in addition to the student center. So we worked with an interior designer to come up with a space that was attractive and we thought students would want to spend time with. So we did the stacks area of our library, we did get new shelving to make it a little more modern, invested in new furniture. Part of the library renovation was the Bookmark Cafe, which is a space students can go in, lounge, take their food in with them. It has coffee, a coffee service there so they can get coffee, as well as a reading area on the new entrance to the library that serves a dual purpose. When the book program is open for those few weeks each semester, it's a waiting area for students as their books are prepared. But when the book program's not in session, we also use it as a reading nook. So it's a quiet area where students can go and relax. It's a quiet area for study. Move from standard computers to laptops and Chromebooks so that students can unplug and move around the library and utilize those new spaces. And try to emphasize that the library has some great views of some of the grounds on campus, and so that an opportunity to better utilize that space. So in terms of, is this program sustainable and can it be replicated on other campuses? It seems to be that it is. We have shared this model widely and given hosted lots of visits from other campuses that have implemented the model. So to date, there have been 3 other community colleges in the University of Arkansas system that have adopted the model, as well as Arkansas State University Newport, one of the community colleges in the ASU system, has also implemented our program. We've also done presentations and hosted visits from 4 other community colleges that are considering implementing the program as well. We wanted to share a few quotes from some of the chancellors of other campuses that have implemented the program. You can see Philip Wilson, the chancellor at U of A Rich Mountain, who fully implemented the program and noted that their students have saved over 50% of the cost of the books from their former book vendor. We also have a quote from Debbie Frazier from the University of Arkansas Community College at Batesville about the success that their program have, and they've been very pleased with their implementation as well.
Now I want to talk about shared lessons. We feel these things that we're going to talk about really make a difference in how the program works. So one of the big things is faculty buy-in. Your faculty are the ones that use the books to teach. They're the ones that go through selection. They recommend the books. They may or may not like bells and whistles with their books. But when you go to a book rental program, there's some really tough decisions that have to be made. And so the first thing I would encourage you to do is do faculty buy-in. And I think when we did the textbook challenge in 2012, 2013, prior to going to a rental program, that really took opportunity for our faculty to be aware of the problem that we had at the time. And so when it came around to 2015 and we were going to do something different, major different, they were pretty much on board with that. The other thing is really selecting your books. It's just not any book out there. It depends on what kind of a revenue stream you want. It depends on how much money you want to save your students. And we really wanted to save our students a lot of money. So our recommendation is to make sure you are using books that are of good quality, those that are maybe that have a paper cover, or now they're the kind that you put in a 3-ring binder. We do not recommend. Those will not last you. So make sure they have a good binding to them. Make sure they're easy to obtain. When we do a textbook recommendation through our curriculum program, we actually have faculty and our textbook manager to look at the book online, see if we can get it. What is the cost currently online? Is there a good source of used books? When we changed our composition book over, everyone takes Comp 1. And so we needed a large number of textbooks. And so knowing exactly what that cost and if they were available without having to go to the actual publisher was very important. Look at the cost of your books, how much they cost. We know some books are just simply more expensive than others, but oftentimes there is a less expensive book that is just as good. And your faculty are your resources. They can add content and add additional material. And then just make sure they can be used for several years. And some books naturally can be used for many years. Our history books, we're using them until we can't get any more of them. Or unless there's some history that's wrong, we're using those books more than 5 years oftentimes, as long as the binding is good and the books can still be replaced online. And then, I don't know how your institution is, but for ours, for example, all of our subject matter faculty, they choose the same book. And so I really want to encourage you to do that. If you have one faculty using this book for biology and then another faculty member using a different book for biology, that's really going to impact your model, because you're going to have a much greater overhead because you need to have extra books on hand, because sometimes you don't know how many students are going to enroll in that course. And then last for this slide, but probably one of the most important things, and Brian mentioned this earlier, and that is to identify your consumables. We did not realize how many consumables we were recommending, we were having as option, or we were even requiring until we started digging into the full model. So you want to decide on those consumables, what are they, and then are you going to make them part of your rental program and simply you'll just replace them every year? So for example, we had a consumable workbook at one point in the science program, and it was so inexpensive, and our book was so inexpensive that we were able to just use that until we found something better later. So let me continue on. Codes. Codes, we had a motto here we called Kill the Code. So basically what we decided to do, we were going to eliminate all codes, but then we would allow codes to come in. That was kind of our universal policy, but then we let the faculty come in and talk to cabinet about their code that they felt like we should keep. And so we had them all present the codes that they felt were important. And at that time, codes were very expensive. And there was kind of an issue. So if you buy the code, you can get the book online for free. But our issue was our students did not have a lot of technology at home. They didn't have computers, so that really didn't work. And so we were having to provide a book in hand, and then the faculty member was providing or requiring a code as well. So you want to decide on the codes. When the faculty did the presentation to us, we were finding, and this was primarily with math at the time, that the codes were extremely expensive. A lot of times they were $150, $200 just by themselves. Faculty were using them in different levels. Some use them exclusively. Some use them rarely. So we had complaints from students saying that they hated the code. It was very finicky, that the instructor hardly ever used it. The videos, there was too much content in the codes and as far as the remediation material and so forth. And the bottom line for some of our requests for the code, faculty liked it because it did great homework, but there was really no substantial evidence to keep the code. Matter of fact, since we eliminated the code, our mathematics department had a 20-30% success rate in some of their remediation courses. Those success rates have skyrocketed to about 70 to 80% now since we've eliminated the code. So I would encourage you to take a really hard look at whether you use a code or not. And I believe except for maybe one course that we use with we share with another campus, we've eliminated all of our book codes. Next is determine how to charge. We charge by credit hour, and that's if the course requires the book. You could be a simple course by course. Maybe it's $25 per course. Maybe it's $50 per course. Maybe you charge a fee when they register for classes in the very beginning, and what that would do is that would allow all students to get a textbook regardless. But for us, we had so many books maybe that were still out there that were being shared by students that we wanted to do it by credit hour. And we knew that we might change this model later on. It's been 5 years, and it seems to be working for us. Identifying your payment methods, how you're going to charge the student. We have a lot of students on financial aid, so we simply charge their account for that. We also have students that are doing scholarships, so that we can charge for that. Some students pay cash. Sometimes we charge to a third party. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes the high schools will will pay for the students' books, and so we can charge to a third party there. You also want to determine whether you have a store inside your rental program. Since our rental program is being used exclusively by our library staff, they don't handle selling of any calculators, t-shirts, things like that. But you could have it inclusive, or you could have it separate, because there will be things that they will need. And then what kind of software program are you going to use? So for us, our students register, and then we have a phenomenal IT director that has coded our Bookstore program so that it pulls their schedule when they swipe their ID. The Bookstore personnel simply do a few clicks, and then what pulls up is actually the books that are associated with those courses. They check those books out to the student, that they are on record that the student has those books, and then if they're not returned, or when they are returned, we check them in, and so they're no longer listed. But if they don't return them by a certain designated day, we run it, and they get charged for a non-return fee. And then my last slide for shared lessons, identify your employee base. We were very fortunate because we had current employees that were already on the payroll, and that we could assign these additional duties. If you have a bookstore already and you have someone that you're using, then that would be a similar case. But if it's not, then you need to look at what your options are, because if you're having to hire someone, this could affect your bottom line. You also want to decide how you want to handle books for special programs, and I'll give you a couple of examples. Nursing. We know nursing textbooks They change frequently. They oftentimes need to be updated at least every 3 years, if not sooner. Sometimes these books are used over, one big book may be used for several classes over a period of a year. We also know nursing students really use their textbooks, and at the end of the year, sometimes they're not very usable or reusable. They're highlighted in, they're written in, and they're wore out. And a lot of times nursing students need to keep those books because they need them to study for their licensure exam. So for our campus, nursing is one of the programs that we do sell their book to them in our foundation store. And we just have a very small markup. Still, it's cheaper than what it would have been had it been through the old model. Another example of this is our diesel program. So we have a 2-year full diesel program. It's segmented into 4 CPs and 2 technical certificates, but they use the same book. And it's a big book, but they use the same book for every course in that program. And it just did not make sense for us to try to rent that book out per credit hour for every semester. Obviously, that book would cost them about $1,000 by the time they're finished. And it just made more sense for us just to sell that book at a good price, and so that they could have that book from now on. And we did not do that with very many. I think maybe 3 or 4 of our programs that we've actually sold the book in. Next, have a good inventory. As Brian mentioned earlier, we ended up, we decided to go on our own in May, and then we had a small summer 2 rental in July and full rental in August. That is not a good time to try to get books. And so we had to really quickly try to find our textbooks on the front end. And you can't always predict when, if you have students that register at the last minute, you can't always predict how many books you may need for a course. Sometimes we need 5 sections of psychology, sometimes we need 3. And so knowing how many books you need can be a little predictive. So you want to make sure you have a good inventory. The one thing that we hadn't really thought about were extra resources. And these are, when I say this, I mean publisher resources. We don't buy our books from the publisher anymore because we invest in used books. Used books are the best way to save money for your students. Buy good used books. So when you no longer buy your books from the publisher, you don't get free stuff anymore. You don't get instructor resources and things like that. So, I would encourage you to use your faculty resources. They are content experts. Remind them that you expect them to develop some of those resources. And a lot of times you can pay them. We've paid faculty to develop resources that we could replicate because they were developed by the faculty member. So just be mindful. You may not be a friend to all of the publishers anymore when you begin buying your books from used companies. And then allow some transition time. We had like 2 months of transition time. Our students actually, we left in May. They returned them to the company that we had on our campus, and come August, they were going to a rental. And even though we tried to tell them that they were renting, they still were convinced that, number one, that they had purchased those books for $60 or less each. And we also had a large number of books floating around campus. So just make sure that you allow some transition time. We do not recommend a summer to transition. We recommend at least a full semester, letting folks know that you're fixing to go to a full on-board rental program. But if you have a year to do that, then you're going to be very prepared when it's time. And then the last one is communication. Communication is very important, getting them returned and getting them returned on time. Their very first year was difficult. At first, students were somewhat confused. They weren't paying attention to that fact that it was a rental program. And so we had several students who thought that they actually purchased those books and that they didn't rent them. So make sure that you have good communication with your students regarding this and regarding when books are due back. We actually now put it in our syllabus. And as you can see here, we got really creative with, so this is free advertising to these folks. So we really went out and tried to be humorously advertise and remind students to return their books, and we got creative. So we've learned to help remind them. All over campus we have signs that says return your books now. So just to get the point across.
Yeah, and I'll note, we weren't sure what to expect in our non-return rates, but over the course of the 5 years, our non-return rate for fiscal years averaged 18%, which is a little higher than we expected. We had some experience we had a grant program that targets non-traditional students who are parents that had a book loan program for a number of years where they loaned students books of especially high cost books like algebra and science courses. And so they had averaged 8 to 10%. So we thought we since it was a much larger program, we anticipated averaging about 12% non-return rate. But it's been pretty steady, 18% average per year, which is higher. And so clearly those efforts to get those books back are important. But we still have a number of students who do not. And so that 18% is the number of books rented, not the number of students who didn't return. And sometimes they lose books, sometimes they destroy books. But that is something to have in mind, and that our investment's a little larger each year because we do have to replace those books.
And we do have a textbook appeal, a return appeal form. Sometimes we have situations where our students, maybe they were in a car accident or we've had some of their trunk leaked or their house. We had a situation where they had a house fire and the books burned up, or maybe they were stolen and they filed a report. And so we have we can waive those costs when there are situations that allow us to do that. So that 18%, was then charged. We charged those students for those books. If they were lost, they can't find them, then they had to pay for that. And then this does give us an idea that on the number of books we have to kind of replace. So 18% of the books usually need replacement. And then sometimes they're just wore out. And so we had to replace them as well.
We did have a very robust discussion on our campus about making this program work, and as Laura noted, our faculty really bought in, and that's very important. I've worked at several institutions, and although you hear students complain about the cost of books, faculty don't always clearly see their role in that cost, and they pick the book they like the best, that they think is the best for the students, often without much regard to that cost. And our faculty have really bought in and consider themselves champions of saving students money. So they work hard to make sure that they have several textbook choices by subject that are all high quality. And then they really look into what's the availability of used text, what's the cost of those, and make that play a big part in the choice they make. I'll be clear, our faculty make those choices on what books we use, but they really put cost as one of the critical factors they consider when they make a textbook selection. We also had a robust discussion in terms of other alternatives. OER, which they are available for very low cost, sometimes no cost, but our students were very clear that they wanted physical textbooks. They did not want digital textbooks, and said if that was their choice, they were going to print them out. So that really wasn't going to work. And we also have the issue that many of our students don't have a device other than their cell phone to use. Arkansas is a low-income, high-poverty state. Our southwest corner of the state has some of the highest poverty rate counties in the state. And so they don't have a device. They don't have good internet access when they're away from campus. And so our options were limited there as well. And we really settled on this as a model that was going to work. Then those discussions about how much we were going to charge and how that was going to work. We discussed whether we should just increase tuition to an amount that would allow us to provide those textbooks to students included in their tuition and fees, but also careful to make sure that we were going to be compliant with all financial aid rules and regulations in terms of student choice. And so we settled on we wanted to give students the option to not participate in the program. So we know in some instances there are books that they can rent or buy cheaper than what they rent them with us for. But we look at it as sort of a managed care model in that, yes, there's some books you could get cheaper, but for college algebra, you're going to rent it up for us from $60, and if you purchase that book, it would be $300. And so that, it smooths out the cost model, and so that they know we have some savvy students who will look and do the math. And we do occasionally have students that come and, they purchased or rented their textbooks cheaper somewhere else or online with Chegg than they could with us. But there's that one book, that accounting, that they would have to pay $300 for, and they want to only rent that book. And so we have to explain that it's an all in or all out. They're welcome to get their books on their own, but if they're going to participate in our program, it's going to be $20 per credit hour, and we're going to give you all your books, whether it's one book for that class or 3 books for that class. And so the first semester we did a lot of explaining, but our students are used to it now. They know that's the model. They like it. It's easy. They show up at the book rental program, hand them their ID, and a few minutes later they get their books and they sign their rental agreement, and they're ready to go. And so if they have financial aid or scholarships on their account, it's posted and charged against that. We have some grant programs on campus that also pay for textbooks, and so that's a third-party option in our software that we developed. Arkansas Rehabilitation Services pays for some students' textbooks, and so that's a choice that's available there as long as we have that on record. And so it's an easy button for most of our students, which our students are often underprepared academically and very fragile economically, and so it's a way for us to make it easy for them and to have their textbooks on day one. The program's worked wonderfully for us and our students.
And I'll add, when we do have that situation where the student has, they have all their books but one, then we help them go to some resources where they can get that one book. Or if they have a book and they don't know what to do with it, there's also areas that will buy their book online. And so we've really worked with students to help them make good use of what they actually have. But yet we still stick to our model that it's an all in or all out. We also had students who once they didn't know any different than the rental program, and so when they transferred to other institutions, they were a little blown away by the cost of books. They thought everyone did book rental the way that we do it at the cost that we have.
And our textbooks are in our schedule with the ISBN numbers, and so that's actually required in Arkansas, and so they're there. So if a student wants to check online first, we'll point them to that so they can look at the ISBN and see if there's a lower cost option. But the issue for many of our students, that requires a credit card, and a substantial number of our students don't have that, so that's not an option for them.
And I think probably the most important thing is students know exactly what it's going to cost for them to attend college here before they even come the first day. Before they even register, they can go in and do the tuition calculator based on where they live, and then they can figure out exactly how much their books are going to cost based on their credit hour. And so students know up front exactly what it's going to cost to go here. And this is really important because prior to that, we just kind of doubled their tuition and said this is what it's going to cost in the past. This concludes our presentation, and I just want to thank you for listening, and I believe now we'll entertain questions.